The wheels turn slow against the frozen dirt, and I feel every rut in the road through the wooden seat beneath me. My hands sit folded in my lap, gloved still, but inside my chest something is already bracing. The horse's breath fogs in front of us. My bonnet strings are tied tight under my chin, tighter than they need to be. Beside me, my husband holds the reins loose, easy, like a man with nothing on his mind. But I know better. I always know. Before we reach the gate, before the church comes into view past the bare trees, he will turn to me the way he turns every Sunday, and he will ask. The gate is still a quarter-mile off, past the fence line where the frost has not yet burned away. I watch it from the corner of my eye, the way you watch a storm you cannot outrun. Samuel clicks his tongue, and the horse quickens, just slightly, just enough that I feel it in my spine. He has not looked at me yet. He never looks at me yet. I know, without turning my head, that somewhere between this rut in the road and that gate, he will ask me the same question he has asked every Sunday morning since the first frost of our marriage. I used to think it was nothing. I am not sure anymore what I think. My name is Rebecca. I was raised in a settlement in northern Indiana, the kind of place where the roads still turn to mud in March, and the only sound after dark is the wind moving through the corn. I was 19 when I married. In our community, we do not date the way the English do. The world outside, we call it English even when it has nothing to do with England at all. We have the Ordnung instead, an unwritten list of rules that shapes everything from the width of a hem to the hour a young man is allowed to walk a girl home from singing. Nobody ever sat me down and explained it to me. You simply learn it the way you learn to breathe, by doing it wrong once and never again. That Sunday, the one I keep returning to, the one this whole story bends around, Samuel asked for something in that buggy that no outsider would understand if I said it plainly. It was not what you are picturing. I have read enough since I left to know what the world assumes when it hears the word demand and the word buggy in the same sentence. It was not that. It was smaller than that, and somehow it was so much heavier. I will tell it to you the way it happened, not the way it sounds when I try to explain it fast. Some things lose their shape if you rush them. Samuel was not a cruel man. I want to say that first, because it matters and because it is true. He rose before the sun to milk 14 cows by hand, and by the time the rest of the world was pouring its first coffee, he had already mended a fence line or fixed a hinge on the hog pen. His own father was harder than mine ever was. I know that now, though I did not know it then, and Samuel carried a kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. He was 23 the summer we married, and he believed, the way a fish believes in water, that the rules he had grown up inside of were simply the shape of the world. It had not always felt heavy. I remember the first time Samuel drove me home from a singing, the two of us wedged onto a bench built for 1.5 people, the reins loose in his hands, and both of us too shy to speak above the sound of the wheels. I remember thinking that this quiet, this closeness, this shared silence was what love was supposed to feel like. My mother had taught me the word Gelassenheit before she ever taught me his name. The yielding, the giving over of your own will to something larger than yourself. God first, then the church, then, though nobody ever said it out loud, your husband. I did not question it. I had been taught not to. There was a Sunday, maybe 8 months into our marriage, when I first noticed the shape of the pattern, though I did not have a name for it yet. Samuel had turned to me in the buggy, this same stretch of road, this same quarter-mile before the gate, and asked me the same quiet question. I answered him honestly, the way I always did, and felt something settle over me afterward, not peace exactly, but something that wore peace's clothing. I told myself it was closeness. I told myself a husband and wife should have no secrets between them, that this was simply what a good marriage looked like from the inside. I did not yet know how many Sundays it would take. By the time the church building comes into view, white clapboard, no steeple, just a long, low roof under a gray sky, Samuel always eases the horse down to a walk. There's a kind of ritual to it, a settling, the same way the whole community seems to exhale a little as the buggies turn into the yard one after another. Naomi's buggy is usually already there by the fence. She said something like this to me once, half laughing, half not, on a bench outside after service, that Eli asked her the very same thing, every single week without fail. I remember laughing along with her. I remember not asking what she meant by the look in her eyes when she said it. The buggy slows. The gate is behind us now, the churchyard opening up ahead, other families climbing down and smoothing their skirts, children ducking beneath their mother's arms toward the door. Samuel pulls the horse to a stop in our usual spot beneath the walnut tree, sets the brake, and for a moment neither of us moves. The morning is very quiet. I can hear my own heartbeat under my apron, steady, waiting. And then he turns to me on the bench, the way he turns every single Sunday, his eyes finding mine for the first time since we left the house. And then he asks. He does not raise his voice. He never has to. "Is there anything you are carrying that does not belong here?" he asks, the same 11 words he has asked every Sunday since our first fall as husband and wife. He means my thoughts. He means the doubts I might have gathered across the week, a grumble against my mother-in-law, a moment of anger at the price of feed, a private wondering about whether the rules truly came from God or simply from men who liked being obeyed. He wants them named, out loud, before we walk through those doors together, so that we enter clean, the two of us as one. That is what he calls it, clean. What nobody tells you is how much work it takes to have nothing to confess. I would spend the ride combing back through my own, weak the way you comb a field for stones, turning over every small resentment, every flicker of doubt, deciding which ones were safe enough to hand him and which ones I would bury a little deeper. Tell myself I had never truly felt. It was not relief when I answered him. It was a kind of narrowing. I held breath, let out only halfway, because I knew this same question was coming again in 7 days, and the 7 days after that, for as long as I lived beside him. I never once asked what would happen if I said no. I did not need to. Meidung, the shunning, was not a word we used casually in our house, but it lived under the floorboards of every conversation, the way winter lives under a frozen pond even in the stillness of August. To refuse him was not simply to refuse a husband. It was to refuse the Ordnung, and the Ordnung was the church, and the church was the only family some of us had left after baptism drew that line between who stayed and who was cut away. I answered him every Sunday, not because I feared Samuel. I answered him because I feared the silence that would follow if I ever stopped. Naomi told me once, on that same bench outside the church, that Eli asked her almost the same question, word for word, as though the two men had been taught it from the same page, because I understood later they had. Her mother had prepared her for it the way mine had prepared me, folding it into wedding advice alongside recipes for chow-chow and instructions for keeping garden. A husband should know his wife's heart, Naomi's mother told her, the same way mine told me, and neither of us thought to ask why it only ever ran in one direction, why no one asked Samuel or Eli what they were carrying. It was not that Sunday, and it was not the Sunday after, but somewhere in the slow accumulation of all those quarter-mile stretches of road, a single thought finally surfaced in me, small and unwelcome as a splinter. I remember exactly where we were, just past the Hostetler fence, the frost still silver on the grass, when I thought, for the very first time in 4 years of marriage, is this love, or is this only obedience wearing love's coat? I did not say it aloud. I am not sure I even let myself finish the thought. But once a splinter is under the skin, the body knows it is there whether you look at it or not. I want to be honest about something, because so much of what gets written about us gets this part wrong. The warmth was real. The singings were real, the harmony of 40 voices in a farmhouse kitchen. No instruments, just breath and belief. The casseroles that appeared on my porch the week my father died were real. Gelassenheit gave me a kind of peace I have never fully found anywhere else since. A stillness some of you might spend your whole lives chasing. All of that is true, and it is also true that a woman can be loved and fed and surrounded, and still be asked to hand over the one thing that was only ever supposed to belong to her. Samuel was not inventing this question out of nowhere. I understand that now in a way I could not then. His own father had asked his own mother the very same words in the very same kind of buggy, on the very same road, for 31 years, and Samuel had grown up believing that was simply what a good husband did, that transparency was intimacy, that a marriage without secrets was a marriage without sin. Nobody had ever asked him whether he wanted to carry that forward. Nobody ever asks the men that question either. He was not guarding me. In his own mind, he was protecting both of us. From a distance, neither of us had the words for yet. If there has ever been a Sunday in your own life, inside a church or far outside one, where you made yourself smaller so someone else could feel comfortable, I think this story was for you. If it felt familiar, I would love it if you stayed, subscribed, and let me hear from you in the comments before I tell you the next one. Now, when a buggy passes me on a back road, my chest still tightens for half a second, out of habit more than fear. I am still Amish in the parts of me that matter. I still believe in the yielding, the Gelassenheit, the giving over of the will to something larger than myself. But before anyone else asks what is in my heart, I have learned, finally, to ask myself first. By our 3rd year of marriage, I no longer waited for Sunday to begin the sorting. It started on Wednesday, sometimes Tuesday, a small, involuntary tally running underneath everything I did, cataloging which of my own thoughts might need explaining by the time we reached the buggy. I would catch myself mid-chore, elbow deep in dishwater, running back through a conversation I'd had at the market, checking it the way you check a hem for a loose thread. I did not call this fear. I called it diligence. I called it being a good wife. It would be years before I understood that the two had quietly become the same word in my mouth. There was one week I did not tell him everything. It was small. I had overheard 2 women near the dry goods store speaking about a family that had left for Ohio, and something in the way they spoke about being English out there, being free of it, had lodged itself in me like a hook. I did not mention it in the buggy. I told myself it was not the kind of thought that needed confessing, that it was only curiosity, harmless as a weather report. But I remember how carefully I avoided his eyes that whole ride, and how much effort it took, and how strange it felt to realize that avoiding his eyes had become its own kind of confession. Nothing happened that Sunday. That was the frightening part. Nothing happened. And yet I spent the following week bracing for something to. My mother-in-law asked me, almost in passing, whether everything was well between Samuel and me, the way you might ask about the weather, except her eyes stayed on my face a beat too long. I said everything was fine. I have thought about that beat too long many times since. I do not believe she knew anything specific. I believe, instead, that the whole community had been trained to notice the particular quiet of a woman who was holding something back, the same way you learn to notice a storm by the color the sky turns before it arrives. By the 4th year, I no longer needed Samuel to ask me anything at all. I had built the question into myself, a small, quiet clerk working behind my ribs at all hours, auditing every private thought before it was even allowed to finish forming. I slept badly on Saturday nights, though I could never have told you why at the time. I would lie beside him, listening to the house settle, running through the week one final time, making certain there was nothing left that might surprise me in the morning light. It is a strange kind of exhaustion, policing your own mind. Nobody sees the bruises from it. There are none to see. There is only a woman who has grown very, very good at being clean. What made it hardest to untangle was that nothing around me agreed there was anything to untangle. My mother had done this. Naomi did this. The women I loved most in the world spoke of transparency between husband and wife as though it were simply a synonym for devotion, and I had no other language handed to me to describe what I was feeling instead. I did not have the word control. Nobody in my life used it, not once, not about a marriage, not about a husband who never raised a hand or a voice. So I called it tiredness. I called it a difficult season. I called it anything except what it was, because I did not yet own the words for what it was. I tried once, carefully, to say something to my Aunt Lydia, a widow who had always seemed to see further than most of us. I told her only a little, that sometimes I felt tired before church, that the ride felt long. She patted my hand and told me that every wife feels the weight of Sunday sometimes, that it would ease with time, that I should pray on it and ask Gelassenheit to soften my heart. She meant it kindly. I have never doubted that she meant it kindly. But I remember driving home that day understanding, for the first time clearly, that even the wisest woman I knew did not have a name for what I was trying to describe, because she had never been given one either. And then, almost cruelly, there would be a Tuesday like any other, Samuel repairing the porch step while I hung wash on the line, the two of us falling into an easy, wordless rhythm, him passing me a clothespin before I even asked for it, both of us laughing at something one of the children said at supper the night before. In those hours, I loved him plainly, without complication, the way I had loved him at 19. That is the part the outside world struggles hardest to believe. It was never only fear in that buggy. It was fear folded inside real tenderness, the two so tightly woven by then that I could not always tell, from one hour to the next, which one I was actually standing inside. It would take one more year and one conversation I never expected to have before I understood that what I had built inside myself was not unique to me or to Samuel or even to our small settlement in Indiana, that it had a shape, a pattern, a history reaching back further than either of our families. That conversation happened on a porch 2 counties over with a woman I had known my whole life and never once really seen. But that comes later. For now, I only knew this. The buggy kept coming down that same stretch of road every Sunday. The frost kept silvering the same fence, and I kept climbing in beside him, smaller each year and calling it devotion. Miriam was my father's cousin, though she was closer to my own age, and for 6 years of my childhood, she simply vanished from every family gathering, every wedding, every canning day, until, just as suddenly, she came back. She had jumped the fence at 22, spent nearly 5 years English in Fort Wayne, working in a diner, living in an apartment with a lock on the door that only she carried the key to. She returned before I married, quietly on her own terms, rejoined the church through the long process required of anyone who leaves and chooses to come home. By the time I sat across from her on that porch, she had lived on both sides of the fence long enough to see each one clearly, the way you can only really see a house once you have stood outside it. I do not know what made me finally say it to her, except that she had a way of listening that did not flinch, and I had spent 4 years around people whose eyes flinched the moment a conversation moved somewhere true. I told her about the buggy. I told her about the question, the same 11 words, every Sunday, and how I had built a small clerk behind my ribs to answer it before it was even asked. I told her about avoiding Samuel's eyes the week I did not confess the thing about the family that left for Ohio. I had never said any of it aloud, start to finish, in that order. Saying it in order was its own kind of shock. Miriam did not tell me I was imagining things, and she did not tell me to pray on it. She set down her coffee and was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. "That is not the Ordnung," she said finally. "That is not written anywhere. I have lived in 3 districts, Rebecca, and I have never once heard a minister preach that a wife must confess her private thoughts to her husband before entering church." I remember how strange it felt, hearing someone separate the two, the faith from the practice, as though they had always been 2 different things wearing the same coat, and nobody had ever shown me where one ended and the other began. What she told me next reframed nearly everything. Her own grandmother had once mentioned, in passing, that this exact habit, the Sunday question, the demand for a clean and open heart before church, had taken root in a handful of families after a hard year in the 1950s, when 3 young people from our district left within the same season and never came back. Some of the fathers, frightened, had begun teaching their sons a new kind of vigilance, one dressed in the language of intimacy and devotion, but built underneath from fear of losing another child to the world. It had never been law. It had never been doctrine. It had simply been fear, passed down carefully enough, generation after generation, that by the time it reached Samuel, it looked exactly like love. Miriam had grown up 1 district over, in a family untouched by that particular fear, and it was part of why she had noticed something was wrong long before I could name it myself. She had nothing to compare it to inside her own marriage, because her own husband had never once asked her such a thing. But she knew of 2 other women from 2 other districts who had described almost the same ritual to her once, years apart, in almost the same words. A pattern with a history is different from a single man's cruelty. It does not make the weight of it lighter, but it changes where you aim your grief. I sat on that porch for a long time after she stopped speaking, watching the light move across the yard, feeling something in my chest come slightly undone. Not shattering, nothing so dramatic, just a long, slow loosening, like a knot finally given enough slack to breathe around. Part of me wanted to be angry at Samuel in that moment, and I found, to my own surprise, that I could not quite get there. He had inherited this the way he inherited his father's hands, his father's way of standing at the stove. He had never chosen it any more than I had chosen to spend for years complying with it. Miriam was careful, too, not to let me walk away hating everything I came from. The church raised me as much as it ever hurt me, she told me before I left that afternoon. I did not come back because I was foolish. I came back because most of what is here is good, and I finally knew the difference between the good and the fear well enough to keep one and refuse the other. I did not yet know, driving home that evening, exactly what refusing it would look like for me. I only knew that for the first time I had a name for what I was carrying, even if I did not yet have the courage to set it down. The following Sunday, Samuel turned to me on the bench the way he always did, passed the same fence, the same quarter-mile before the gate, and asked the same 11 words he had asked for 5 years running, in the same even voice he always used, as though he were asking whether I had remembered to bring the pie for the fellowship meal. I opened my mouth to answer the way I always had. Quickly, thoroughly, a small offering laid down before it could be asked for twice. And for the first time in 5 years of marriage, something in me hesitated. I did not know yet what I was going to say. I only knew, sitting there in the cold, that I finally had a choice in front of me that I had never let myself see before. I did not tell him everything that Sunday. I told him the truth, but not all of it. I said only that I had felt tired that week, unsettled, that nothing serious had happened, which was true enough to satisfy him and false enough to be, for the first time, entirely mine. Samuel nodded, the way he always nodded, and turned back to the reins, and if he noticed the smaller shape of my answer, he said nothing about it. The gate came and went. The church rose up white against the gray sky the way it always did. And I walked in beside him that morning, carrying something private inside me for the very first time in 5 years of marriage, and nothing at all, fell apart because of it. That is the part one most want people to understand, the part the loudest versions of these stories always skip past for the sake of drama. There was no scene. No door was slammed. Samuel did not raise his voice or demand to know why my answer had grown shorter. The sky did not change color. I simply kept a little more of myself for myself, the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, small measured withholdings, the way you might slowly widen a crack in a dam without ever meaning to bring the whole structure down. It took the better part of 2 years before I understood that I had been quietly, carefully, unbuilding something the entire time. We left the district 4 years later, not in anger, not in one dramatic night, but the way most real changes actually happen, slowly through 100 small conversations that finally added up to a decision neither of us could have named out loud the year before. Samuel came with me in the end, though that is its own long story, one I may tell you another time. We're not fully English now, and we're not quite what we were either. We live somewhere in between, in a small house with a door that locks from the inside, which still, some mornings, catches me by surprise, the simple fact that the lock is mine and nobody is waiting on the other side of it expecting an answer. It was a counselor 2 years after we left who first gave me a plain, ordinary name for what had happened in that buggy. Not to shame Samuel, she was careful to say, and not even necessarily to shame the community, but simply to name a pattern for what it was, a demand for constant transparency, dressed as intimacy, that had slowly taught me my own inner life was not fully mine to keep. I remember sitting in her small office, hearing her say it plainly, and feeling something I had not expected to feel. Not vindication, just relief, The specific relief of finally hearing, out loud, from someone with no stake in the outcome, that I had not imagined the weight of all those Sundays. I tell you this not to frighten anyone away from faith, or from marriage, or from a community that, for all its weight, also raised me with real love. I tell you this because I have come to believe that the hardest kind of harm to see clearly is the kind that never once raises its voice, the kind that asks for your heart so gently, so consistently, that you mistake the asking itself for love. If you have ever answered a question honestly out of fear rather than trust, and called it devotion because you did not yet have a better word for it, I want you to know that you are not foolish for missing it. Most of us miss it. That is exactly how it is built to work. You do not have to have grown up Amish for this to sound familiar to you. You do not have to have ridden in a single buggy in your life. Maybe your version of that question came across a dinner table, or through a phone that was never really yours to keep private, or in a silence you learned to fill before anyone had to ask you to fill it. The shape changes. The mechanism, more often than you would think, stays exactly the same. Someone asking for your inside life, gently enough, consistently enough, that handing it over starts to feel like the only kind of love you are allowed. These days, when I hear a buggy come down a back road near where I live now, I do not flinch the way I once thought I always would. I just watch it pass, wheels turning slow against the dirt, and I think about a much younger version of myself sitting very still on that bench, hands folded, waiting to be asked. I would tell her, if I could, that devotion was never supposed to require disappearing. I would tell her that a love which needs to own your thoughts to feel secure was never really asking for love at all. It was only ever asking for control, wearing love's coat, riding beside you the whole way to church. I have a daughter now. She is young yet, young enough that Sundays for her still mean windows of sunlight through gauzy curtains and the smell of something baking. Nothing heavier than that. I do not know yet what I will teach her about hearts and honesty and how much of either person is required to hand over to be loved well. I only know I will choose my words for her more carefully than anyone chose theirs for me. If there is one thing I hope this story leaves, with you it is only this. Your heart was never meant to be a toll you pay at a gate. It was only ever meant to be yours.